Hello, friends. I am glad to see you again. Today I'm going to tell you about an HOA that didn't expect who owned the house. I'll start at the beginning, but I promise I won't take you on a boring backstory. It all began around the time we moved into this community about 2 years ago. My father-in-law, Kenton, is a savvy real estate investor. He's owned several properties for decades, mostly single-family homes in various suburbs around the country. He has a knack for spotting hidden gems, fixing them up, and renting them out. For years, he's used these rental properties to help fund college savings for his grandchildren, my kids and my sister-in-law's children, and also to keep his retirement nest egg growing. When Sasha and I moved to this neighborhood, Kenton gifted us the down payment so we could purchase the house we're currently living in. We have a mortgage, but he made it more manageable by helping us with the biggest chunk up front. Our home is a cozy place with 4 bedrooms, a decent backyard, and an attached 2-car garage. It's perfect for a growing family, and we love the quiet environment. Then Cassandra became president of the HOA and everything changed. From what I understand, Cassandra had been renting a property in the same community for about a year before I arrived. The house she occupies is much larger than ours. It's a 2-story place with a big front yard, a swimming pool out back, and an ornate front door that she's always showing off. She loves telling people about the fancy upgrades she made, like designer fixtures in the kitchen or custom tile in the foyer. But what Cassandra never revealed, and I had no idea of initially, was that she didn't own this upscale home. She was a tenant, and guess who her landlord was? My father-in-law, Kenton. That's right. Unbeknownst to me, Kenton was actually the legal owner of the very house she lived in. I only found that out after we'd had our share of neighborly run-ins. Kenton had told me he owned 4 properties around the region, but we never talked specifics. I knew he had tenants in each property, but I didn't know which exact house belonged to him. The confusion on my end was due to how busy I was. New job responsibilities, 3 kids, Sasha's part-time photography business, and the constant hustle of life. So I just never bothered to ask him for the addresses of every property he owned. In hindsight, I should have realized something was amiss when I first saw Cassandra's face the day I moved in. She looked me up and down with a scrutinizing gaze, as if she recognized me but couldn't place from where. At the time, I chalked it up to typical neighborly curiosity. A few months into living here, I started hearing loud music around 11 p.m. or midnight, sometimes later. On weekends, it was even worse. There were times music blared until 2 in the morning. Mind you, I have kids, one of whom is on the autism spectrum and has a hard time dealing with unpredictable loud noises. My youngest, Oliver, would often come running to our bed on those noisy nights, tears streaming down his cheeks because he couldn't sleep. Naturally, I wanted to handle this diplomatically. I went over to Cassandra's house in the late afternoon after one particularly rowdy weekend party. I rang the doorbell and politely let her know that the music was keeping my family up. She smiled thinly and acted like she had no idea it was that loud. Said something along the lines of, "Oh, you know how these gatherings can get out of hand." She promised to keep it down. Well, that promise lasted exactly 1 week. By the next weekend, she was back at it. Another late-night bash, more noise, more complaining on my end. This time, I left a polite note in her mailbox, thinking maybe if she didn't like direct confrontation, a note would suffice. It didn't help. I ended up calling the local non-emergency police line to file a noise complaint because it was near 2:30 in the morning, and I was at my wit's end. An officer came out, presumably spoke with her, and the music was turned off shortly afterward. That officer's visit was apparently the last straw for Cassandra. The next day, I found an official-looking letter taped to my door with the HOA letterhead. It stated that I'd been cited for unreasonable noise disturbances, and that I'd be facing a potential fine if I didn't rectify the problem. That was baffling to me because I was the one complaining about the noise. At first, I assumed it was some mix-up. Maybe the HOA had no idea who was actually causing the commotion, and they put the blame on me by mistake. But then I realized who the president of that HOA was. I could practically hear Cassandra cackling in her living room, grinning over the keyboard as she typed up that citation. Sasha and I decided to attend the next HOA meeting to clear things up. There was a modest turnout, maybe a dozen or so people from the neighborhood. Cassandra ran the show. She sat at the head of the table with her arms folded and her expression stern. I tried to bring up my concerns about the late-night gatherings, but Cassandra turned it around on me. She claimed her gatherings weren't so loud and suggested I was actually the one making noise at odd hours. saying something preposterous like she heard loud arguing or banging noises from my property around midnight. The folks at the meeting seemed a bit taken aback, but some of them knew Cassandra well enough to nod in agreement or remain silent. I got the sense that she had a small group of loyal supporters who'd simply believe anything she said. Toward the end of the meeting, Cassandra informed me that the board would have to investigate these allegations, and that if they discovered I was indeed creating disturbances or filing nuisance complaints, they would take the necessary steps, including eviction, to preserve the peaceful environment of the neighborhood. My jaw nearly hit the floor. I challenged her on the idea of an HOA having the authority to evict a homeowner, especially since I was paying my mortgage to a bank, not to the HOA. But Cassandra insisted that, per the association's bylaws and state regulations, if a homeowner repeatedly violates neighborhood standards or fails to pay cumulative fines, the HOA has the right to place a lien or potentially force a sale. It's complicated legal territory, but I knew such processes weren't as easy as snapping one's fingers. Still, the threat was enough to rattle me. I tried to remain respectful in front of the other neighbors, but inside, I was livid. As soon as Sasha and I got home, I fired up my laptop and started reading our HOA documents. Sure enough, there was some language in there about liens and foreclosures if someone was severely delinquent in dues or if there was a large sum owed for violations. It would be a nightmare to sort through a legal fight with them, especially with 3 kids in the house. So I was determined to do everything above board, document every instance of noise, and make sure I had a strong paper trail. If Cassandra wanted a fight, I'd be sure to bring receipts. While all this was unfolding, I gave my father-in-law Kenton a call. Initially, I just wanted advice on how to handle a troublesome neighbor and a bullying HOA president. Kenton had more experience dealing with property management and local regulations than anyone else I knew. Over the phone, Kenton sounded unusually amused. At first, he asked me a lot of questions about this Cassandra. How did she look? How old was she? Any distinguishing features? I gave him a description. Tall, with shoulder-length blonde hair that always seemed meticulously styled, a penchant for wearing flashy rings, and a tendency to drive a top-of-the-line SUV with tinted windows. Kenton let out a low whistle when I described her vehicle, then told me to hold on a second. He rummaged through some paperwork in his home office and eventually started reading a lease agreement. A lease agreement, it turned out, with Cassandra's name on it. That was how I found out that Cassandra was renting from Kenton. My father-in-law asked if the house she lived in had a bright blue front door. I told him no. That was the only detail missing from the picture. Kenton explained that the front door in his records was indeed blue, but the tenant had the right to change the paint color with written permission from the property manager. Since Cassandra had been living there for a little over a year, it was possible she had changed it to something else. And then it hit me. I distinctly remembered Cassandra bragging about how she had installed a new, custom-made door shipped from Europe. Maybe that's why it didn't match the lease description. When I confirmed the address with Kenton, he burst out laughing. He said, "Son, I hate to say it, but you basically own that woman's house." I was confused, so he elaborated. "I mean, I've always told you and Sasha that any rent I collect from my tenants goes straight into a special fund for my grandchildren. Your kids included. Think of it like you're indirectly benefiting from that property. I never expected you'd end up in the same neighborhood. This is too rich." Indeed, it was a bizarre twist of fate. The same person who was threatening to evict me from my home was literally paying rent to my father-in-law. She was financing my children's future with every check she wrote. Kenton told me not to do anything rash. He suggested I keep documenting Cassandra's misbehavior. He himself would dig through the lease, watch for any violations she might have committed, and see if any of her antics broke local laws or the terms of her rental agreement. He reminded me that, as the landlord, he held the power to evict if Cassandra was consistently violating property rules or disturbing the peace. It had to be done legally, but he was more than willing to initiate the process if she was indeed being a problematic tenant. Now, in my own mind, I realized I had a certain leverage, but I didn't want to stoop to Cassandra's level of petty aggression, especially not in an underhanded way. That's just not how I was raised. My mother always taught me that 2 wrongs don't make a right. If Cassandra wanted to escalate things, I'd handle it calmly, with facts and documents, and let the law take its course if necessary. However, a part of me couldn't help feeling a little thrill. It was justice, in a sense, that the very house she was bragging about, the one she tried to pretend she owned, was actually in my extended family's portfolio. Things escalated quickly. Cassandra started issuing more citations against me, one for supposedly letting my trash bins stay out too long on the curb, even though I brought them in within 24 hours, another for having an unapproved color scheme on my shutters, and then a ridiculous warning claiming that my kids were trespassing on HOA property when they rode their bikes on the sidewalk in front of her driveway. It was all nonsense. Even some of the quieter neighbors began to notice how one-sided her enforcement was. I recall an incident where my oldest daughter, Nina, was drawing chalk art on our driveway with her friends. No one else was around, and she didn't wander onto Cassandra's property or the sidewalk. The next morning, I got a notice in my mailbox condemning unauthorized decorations that deface community surfaces, chalk art, on my own driveway. It was an absurd level of micromanaging, and it made me wonder how many other homeowners she'd harassed in the past. Sasha was understandably worried. Our kids sensed the tension. They asked why the lady next door was so mad at us, and we tried to keep it vague, explaining that sometimes grown-ups disagree over neighborhood rules. But the stress was undeniably creeping in. The fines started piling up. Over the course of a month, I received letters totaling over $1,000 in alleged HOA fines. Knowing full well that these were baseless, I filed formal disputes for each one, referencing actual clauses in the HOA agreement and local ordinances to prove my innocence. I also started making calls to the local city code enforcement office, confirming that the chalk art, the trash bins, and the shutter colors were all non-issues that wouldn't violate any city regulations. I documented every phone call, email, and interaction. This was building toward a larger confrontation, and I wanted to be fully prepared if Cassandra tried to push me into a corner. Cassandra must have caught wind that I was fighting back. In a show of arrogance, she taped a new notice to my door one morning. It read, in large, bold letters, that due to repeated infractions and failure to comply with HOA standards, my membership in the community association could be revoked. As a result, I would be subject to forced eviction proceedings as outlined in the bylaws. This was a scare tactic to get me to bend the knee or possibly move out on my own. But I wasn't about to do that. We had a mortgage. This was our family home. And to top it off, Kenton had specifically warned me that she was going to do something desperate. Later that same day, I got a call from Kenton. He said he had discovered even more startling information. Cassandra's parties had led to multiple complaints not just from me, but from at least 2 other neighbors on the opposite side of the street. They'd complained to the local police as well. One neighbor wrote a letter to him, as the property owner gleaned from public property records, complaining about frequent nighttime disturbances. While these neighbors didn't know Kenton personally, they found out who owned the house through the city's property appraiser database. They wanted him, as the landlord, to know what was going on. Kenton was absolutely livid that Cassandra was tarnishing his property's reputation and disturbing good people who lived nearby. A day or two later, Kenton discovered that Cassandra had made certain renovations to the property without going through the proper channels. She'd replaced some fixtures without official permission from him. And apparently, she also drilled holes in an exterior wall to mount a large TV on the outside patio so she could have a theater experience during her pool parties. This was explicitly against the lease, which required any major structural changes to have written landlord approval. Kenton now had more than enough grounds to file a notice of lease violation. But Kenton waited because he sensed a bigger meltdown was coming from Cassandra, and he wanted to give her enough rope to hang herself, so to speak. In the meantime, I tried to carry on with my normal life. I attended PTA meetings, went to my kids' soccer matches, and put in the hours at my own job. Even though the looming threat of an HOA eviction weighed on me, I had faith that we'd sort it out legally. My biggest concern was that Cassandra might lash out in some new, unpredictable way. Sure enough, she did. One Saturday evening, I was in my backyard grilling hamburgers while Sasha prepared some sides in the kitchen. My 3 kids were playing in the lawn. Out of nowhere, Cassandra came storming over, let herself into my backyard through the side gate, and started yelling that I needed to keep those brats inside because they were ruining the neighborhood ambiance. She rambled that they were being too loud, that the squeals of laughter were piercing her eardrums, and she even claimed I was breaking the rules about large gatherings. In truth, it was just my family, no one else. She also pointed her finger in my face, demanding I pay the outstanding HOA fines right away, or else the board would vote to evict me at the next monthly meeting. I told her calmly but firmly that she was trespassing on my property and asked her to leave immediately. She refused. Sasha came outside, phone in hand, ready to call the police. When Cassandra saw Sasha with the phone, she backed off a bit, muttered something, and stomped out of the yard. We documented that incident too. Date, time, a summary of what was said. I even took photos of the footprints she left in a muddy patch near the garden, just in case. My mother always said that the devil is in the details. I was going to have every detail on my side if this went to court. That encounter gave me the final push to let Kenton go full steam ahead with his eviction process. I had told him earlier that I didn't want him to do anything unless absolutely necessary, because I was hoping Cassandra would just back off. But she clearly wasn't going to stop. She was on a power trip, trying to prove she could bully anyone in the neighborhood, even the people who indirectly owned the house she lived in. So I told Kenton, do what you have to do. Being a careful man, Kenton decided to consult his own attorney first. Between the multiple lease violations, the complaints from multiple neighbors, her unapproved property modifications, and police reports on record for noise disturbances, the attorney believed there was a solid case. The next day, Cassandra got a notice to cure or vacate in her mailbox, courtesy of Kenton's legal representative. It listed every documented lease violation with evidence attached. She had 10 days to fix the issues and assure the landlord in writing that there would be no more disturbances, or else she would have to leave. I wish I could have been a fly on the wall when Cassandra read that notice. On the one hand, I felt a bit sorry for her. Nobody wants to get evicted. But on the other hand, she had no problem gleefully threatening me with eviction from my own home, so my pity was limited. This was a matter of protecting my household, my children's well-being, and my financial investment in this community. Cassandra's immediate response was to double down. She must have believed she was untouchable because at the next HOA meeting, she tried to announce that I owed thousands of dollars in fines, and that if I didn't pay within 5 days, she'd be forced to initiate a lien on my property. People in the audience looked uncomfortable. Some of them had never seen an HOA board enforce fines so aggressively. One homeowner, a soft-spoken woman named Marisol, raised her hand and asked Cassandra to justify the fines. Marisol mentioned that she'd personally walked by my home many times and never observed any of the alleged violations. Cassandra brushed her off with a vague statement like, "I have documented proof and that's all you need to know." That was when I calmly stood up, thanked Marisol for her input, and presented my own folder of documentation. I started reading from the City Code Enforcement Guidelines, pointing out exactly how chalk drawings on a private driveway do not constitute vandalism or an HOA violation. I also referenced the time-stamped photos of my trash bins, showing they were taken off the curb well within the required time. Then I mentioned that the local city code does not regulate shutter colors the way Cassandra claimed, and that our HOA guidelines didn't mention shutters at all. As I explained these points, the other board members kept glancing at one another. One of them, a gentleman named Terrence, asked Cassandra if she had a rebuttal. She just mumbled something unintelligible and refused to look me in the eye. I ended my remarks by politely stating that I believed these fines were levied out of malice, not factual evidence, and I had already sought legal advice to protect my rights as a homeowner. Then I thanked the board for their time and sat down. The room was dead silent for a few moments. Cassandra looked like she wanted to sink into the floor. After the meeting, Terrence and another board member approached me quietly. They apologized for how Cassandra had been acting and confided that they were never comfortable with her leadership style. They hinted that there was a motion to remove her as HOA president if she kept abusing her position. I thanked them, feeling a bit lighter, though I was still cautious. Cassandra was a wild card, and I knew she could lash out unpredictably. The final showdown happened a few days later. Kenton's eviction process was well underway because Cassandra had not complied with the cure portion of the notice. She'd neither addressed the noise complaints nor undone the unauthorized modifications. The next legal step was to file for a formal eviction. Cassandra, in her desperation, tried to mount one last effort to blame me. She submitted a complaint to the local small claims court, alleging that I was harassing her and causing her emotional distress. She claimed I had singled her out and was spying on her, forging documents, and trying to sabotage her life. It was an absurd accusation. The court scheduled a hearing to review her allegations. The day of the hearing, I showed up with Sasha, who had a binder full of evidence neatly organized. Kenton came too, accompanied by his attorney. Cassandra arrived alone, No lawyer, just a stack of random papers. Before the judge, she told a dramatic story of how I had waged a personal vendetta against her, orchestrating complaints with the neighbors and forging documents to give to her landlord. She tried to paint me as some unscrupulous busybody with too much time on my hands. The judge listened politely, then turned to me and asked if I had any response. I explained how the entire matter began with legitimate noise complaints, how I discovered through my father-in-law that she was actually renting the property, and how all the official documents, including police reports and code enforcement confirmations, supported my account. Then Kenton's attorney provided copies of the lease agreement and the official notices sent to Cassandra for violation of the rental terms. The judge flipped through them, nodding. On top of that, we had statements from 2 other neighbors who experienced the late-night parties and noise disturbances. Those neighbors had also been harassed or intimidated by Cassandra when they tried to address the matter privately with her. When Cassandra realized her arguments were falling apart, she started shouting about how I was in the wrong for pretending to be the owner of her house. She claimed I had manipulated the landlord, my own father-in-law, into evicting her without cause. The judge patiently asked her to calm down and pointed out that the documents showed multiple valid grounds for eviction. Cassandra tried to protest, but the evidence was undeniable. The judge dismissed her complaint, stating that there was no proof of my alleged harassment or document forgery. Afterwards, Cassandra stomped out of the courtroom. Less than a week later, she received the final eviction judgment from the court, giving her a short time window to vacate the premises. I heard from a neighbor that she had a massive meltdown when the sheriff's notice was delivered. She spent days frantically packing and trying to find a new place to live. Some people in the community saw her carrying boxes to her car in the early morning hours. Others heard her ranting about how unfair it all was and that she would get revenge someday. But with her departure, the entire neighborhood seemed to breathe a collective sigh of relief. In the weeks that followed, the HOA board called a special meeting to discuss new elections for the president's position, since Cassandra was effectively gone. I attended, mostly out of curiosity. Terrence stepped up to fill the role temporarily. He apologized to the entire community for Cassandra's behavior, emphasizing that the board would strive to be transparent, fair, and neighborly going forward. Several other residents used the opportunity to share their experiences of being picked on by Cassandra. One man told a story about being fined for having a small decorative statue in his garden, and an older woman mentioned how Cassandra once threatened her for letting her grandson chalk on the sidewalk. Hearing all these stories, I felt relief that none of us would have to deal with such pettiness anymore. Kenton eventually had the house cleaned and repainted after Cassandra moved out. He replaced the fancy door she installed with a more traditional front door, matching the exterior's original style. He also covered up the holes in the patio wall where Cassandra had mounted her outdoor TV. That property is in the process of being rented again, this time to a family that actually respects the HOA's rules and keeps to themselves. As for me, I never ended up paying a single penny of the so-called fines Cassandra tried to impose. My documented evidence and official disputes nullified every one of them. I still own my home, my kids still run freely in the yard, and we can once again enjoy peaceful evenings without the pounding bass from all-night pool parties. Best of all, Kenton reaffirmed what he told Sasha and me a long time ago, that when the time comes, the property Cassandra had been renting will be transferred to Sasha and me in his will. In other words, if there was any doubt about who truly owned the place, that doubt is long gone. In a sense, it's ironic that Cassandra's house hunting journey led her into the arms of the very family she attempted to bully. Life has a strange way of weaving these ironic threads together. If she had just been a considerate neighbor, just turned the music down at a reasonable hour, none of this would have happened. Instead, she made her bed, figuratively speaking, and ended up losing the very roof over her head. Throughout this entire ordeal, I learned a few lessons that I think are worth sharing. First, always read your HOA documents thoroughly. Know your rights and responsibilities. Cassandra tried to use the bylaws as a cudgel, but understanding those rules allowed me to pinpoint her overreach. Second, keep meticulous records. Dates, times, photos, receipts, the whole 9 yards. The more evidence you have, the harder it is for someone to twist reality. Third, never underestimate the power of patience. As furious as I was at times, I avoided stooping to Cassandra's level. With the help of my father-in-law and the legal system, the truth came out in a decisive and fair manner. I also took a deeper look at how sometimes people in positions of local power, like an HOA president, can get carried away. Perhaps Cassandra once had good intentions, but the taste of control led her down a path of intimidation and petty enforcement. For me, it was essential to stand my ground, not just for my own sake, but for the sanity of my family and neighbors. The moment you let someone like that push you around, they'll keep pushing until you're cornered. My father-in-law, Kenton, is relieved that he no longer has a troublesome tenant damaging his investment and his reputation. He's thankful I kept him in the loop, and he's apologized for not giving me a heads up that he owned a property in my very neighborhood. Honestly, I don't hold it against him. He's a busy man with multiple properties in different regions, and I never bothered to ask for a full breakdown. Now, we're on the same page. From this point forward, whenever he's about to rent to someone in my neighborhood, he'll run it by me first, just to make sure we don't have any more fiascos like this one. For our kids, life is back to normal. They love playing in the yard, and the stress that hovered over our household has lifted. Sometimes Oliver asks, "Is that loud lady gone for good?" And I can reassure him that yes, she's gone. We now have wonderful neighbors around us, and the new HOA leadership seems genuinely interested in fostering a sense of community rather than policing every little detail. Chalk drawings are welcome, as they should be. The one positive outcome from Cassandra's reign is that it brought the rest of the neighborhood closer together. People who barely spoke to each other before began exchanging notes about the situation, offering mutual support and forging friendships in the process. One unexpected subplot in all of this involved a man named Marcus, who lives across the street. I never interacted with him much prior to all the drama, but when he noticed the commotion, he came over one day to introduce himself. He shared his own story about how Cassandra tried to fine him for having a small workshop in his garage, claiming it violated some vague rule about business operations in a residential area. The irony was that Marcus works on woodworking projects strictly for personal enjoyment, not for profit. He had challenged her on it, threatened to involve a local lawyer, and she quietly dropped the issue. That was months before we moved in, and he'd been wary of her ever since. Marcus offered to help me fix up some of the minor damages in my backyard fence, stuff that I had to put off while dealing with the bigger fight. He refused any payment, saying it was his way of thanking me for taking on the big boss. Over a few weekends, he and I replaced some broken boards, repainted sections of the fence, and even made a custom sign with our family name on it. That sign now hangs proudly on the fence gate. It was a simple, neighborly gesture, but it meant a lot to me. I realized how valuable it is to have a community that looks out for each other instead of living in isolation. Another side plot involved my wife, Sasha, who is a talented photographer. She had mostly done portraits and small weddings, but as the tension with Cassandra escalated, Sasha found an outlet in capturing everyday moments around the neighborhood. Kids riding bikes, dogs playing in the park, flowers blooming by the pond. She put together a little photo series called Our Community. It started as a personal project, but after Cassandra was evicted, Sasha decided to share the series with some neighbors. Everyone loved it. The photo series captured the real essence of what living here should feel like. Friends and families bonding, quiet streets, and a sense of warmth. It was the exact opposite of the negativity Cassandra brought. Word spread, and Sasha ended up printing several copies for people who wanted to hang them in their foyers or living rooms. It was a reminder of the peaceful life we're all aiming for. Friends, thank you. See you soon.